The English countryside is a deceptive terrain. It looks so sweet, so friendly, so innocent, but it's none of those things. Anyone who's listened to a few episodes of The Archers will already know that dark stuff happens in the English countryside. Sharp of tooth, red of claw, it's a deadly battleground. The great English painter Thomas Gainsborough certainly knew this. He was a country boy, born and bred, a Suffolk lad. Gainsborough recognised that beneath the deceptively innocent surfaces of outdoor England, unpleasantness was thriving. Lives were being ruined. Greed was being shown. Voila, Gainsborough's masterpiece of outdoor Englishness, his famous double portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Endruz. Summer corn glistening in the sun, fluffy clouds scudding across the sky, English oaks dotting the horizon, and sitting in front of it all like a pair of giant spiders in the middle of a web, Mr. and Mrs. Endruz. Him with his big gun and his nonchalance. She with the most puzzlingly unpleasant expression in the whole of Gainsborough's art. If this woman invited me up to spend the weekend at her big country house, I don't think I'd accept. Something's going on here. It's a pretty scene, it's merry England, but something's going on here. This is Gainsborough's town, Sudbury in Suffolk, where Mr. Endruz and Gainsborough probably went to school together. It's a tea and cakes town these days, somewhere ye oldie on the tourist circuit. But when Gainsborough was born here in 1727, this was a real slab of rural England, a cloth town in serious decline.
Daniel Defoe came and visited Sudbury quite early on in the century and thought that it was a very, very poor place, and with one or two rich people, and all the poor people may well eat the rich ones, he said. So it was quite a depressed town, and Sudbury has always been an earthy little working town, and its main industry has been weaving. And indeed the Gainsborough family were concerned with that, not only Gainsborough's father, but also his, very much more successfully, his uncle. But it was quite a shaky business, I think.
They made velvet here. Wool, of course, Sudbury is surrounded by sheep, and, interestingly, silk. This is Gainsborough's garden, and this beautiful old survivor is a mulberry tree, planted here in 1610. It would have been handy for the Gainsboroughs to have a mulberry tree in the garden, because mulberry trees are what silkworms feed on, and the Gainsboroughs were in the cloth trade. Gainsborough's father was a trader in fine materials. And so, in a way, was his son. If you ever get a chance to examine closely a portrait by Gainsborough in his prime, have a good look at the clothes they're wearing. The silks, the satins, the brocades, the lace. He had a genius for painting precious fabrics. He knew about them from birth, and loved them dizzily, I think. Picture after picture, by Gainsborough at his best, is a glorious advert for his father's calling. Even Mrs. Endruz, the baddie in this picture, gets an outfit to die for. Pale blue silk in an outrageous expanse. Not what you'd usually wear if you're out killing pheasants. I get the feeling in a lot of Gainsborough's pictures that he liked the clothes more than he liked the people wearing them. He was notoriously unimpressed by his sitters. When he was painting Sarah Siddons, the most celebrated actress of her times, the Elizabeth Hurley of the Georgian age, he suddenly exploded, "Damn your nose, there's no end to it." And behind the backs of his sitters, he was even more scathing.
Yes, he was known to complain about his sitters, but I think being a portraitist is really a considerable problem, that you have all these people who by definition want to look better than they probably do. And that, having that day in, day out of about 8 people a day, must be a considerable problem. And most portraitists got very, very bored with self-important people rushing through their studio all day.
Gainsborough hated doing fashionable portraits. The cursed face business, he called it. His tragedy was he was so damn good at it. They only have one part worth looking at, said Gainsborough of the fashionable types he painted, and that is their purse. So he sniffed the air and headed for where the biggest purses were gathered. He moved to Bath, where all the celebrities of Georgian England would visit to take the waters and to have their likeness done by Thomas Gainsborough, the Mario Testino of his age. He ended up in London, naturally, the most fashionable portrait painter in England, who was usually forgiven his little rudenesses because he captured a likeness better than anyone else. He had the gift all right. Gainsborough had the fastest hands of any painter this country's ever produced. He painted like an expert swordsman. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And the rich have always been able to take a bit of rudeness from their artists in return for some breathtaking immortality.
He realised that he had to cover a vast amount of canvas in order to compete with people. There are 1 or 2 records of head and shoulder portraits which he completed in 1 hour 40 minutes, and that is going at sensational speed. There's records of him getting drunk for a fortnight and then doing a skirt of a great full-length portrait in a night. So I think he used that speed to good effect so that he could get drunk for a fortnight, and also so that he could get through the acreage of canvas and compete in a real way.
Gainsborough was the youngest of 9 children. His father, the cloth merchant, fell on hard times and was bankrupt. Young Thomas wasn't going to enter the cloth business. He had another talent, art. And according to a story, which I don't quite believe, but I'll tell you anyway, when he was a boy, he saw a man trying to steal pears from his garden and drew him so convincingly that the neighbours recognised this scoundrel immediately and nabbed him. Young Gainsborough was also naughty. Another story, which I do believe, is that he used to forge his own sick notes for school and captured his parents' handwriting perfectly. From his days of forging sick notes at school and throughout his life, Gainsborough was a subtle subversive, always doing things on the sly. At the age of 18, he got married, in secret, to the illegitimate daughter of a duke. He'd got her pregnant. She brought in £200 a year, which was very useful, and which Gainsborough began to supplement busily by painting some of the most memorable portraits in British art. This is the house the Gainsboroughs lived in. It's an estate agent's now, and no one seems to know what went on in which room. But it could be that this is the spot in which Gainsborough painted Mr. and Mrs. Endruz. These days, the picture hangs in the National Gallery and is famous the world over as Gainsborough's earliest masterpiece. But until 50 years ago, no one outside the Endruz family even knew it existed. The National Gallery didn't buy it until 1960. So here's an interesting question. Why was this painting kept so secret for so long? Endruz inherited half of the estate from his father, Aubrey's it was called. His wife brought in the other half when they married in 1748. So although it wasn't, strictly speaking, a marriage of convenience, it was certainly a most convenient marriage, which left both of them twice as rich as they had been. So far, so normal. Here are two small-town moneybags celebrating the union of two big-time purses. But something went wrong in the making of this much-moneyed wedding portrait. I often watch people walking past this entertaining picture and enjoy it a lot. But it's amazing how often they miss two crucial things about it. One is how frightening Mrs. Endruz is, but the second is that it's unfinished. If you look closely at that brown splodge in the middle of her lap, something's missing. The picture is incomplete. Gainsborough never had his final say in this painting. He meant to show something here, but never did. What was it? And why did he never put it there? Why is Mr. and Mrs. Endruz unfinished? These are the questions that need to be asked. Here you have a painting that's famous the world over as the perfect image of rural England. But just as paradise had a snake in it, so Mrs. Endruz had on her lap something that never got painted, something that someone somewhere didn't want us to see. And I'm sure I know what it is. The single most aggressive and destructive act ever perpetrated by the government of Britain on its rural folk was the long and drawn-out passing of the Enclosure Acts, which took the common land away from the people, put a fence around it, and gave it to the landlords. It was unforgivable. It ruined the livings of so many country people. Gainsborough's heart always went out to them. The poor had his sympathy, not the rich and the landed, like Mr. and Mrs. Robert Endruz. This is the exact spot on which Gainsborough painted his wonderful picture. You must recognise that oak behind me, this big fat English oak, which is exactly the same tree, although it's thicker now than it was before. And over there, of course, is that beautiful slab of the English countryside, which is behind Mr. and Mrs. Endruz in the picture. Still, I think, really recognisable. Now, Mr. Endruz is standing just about here. He's been out hunting, so he's holding his shooting rifle nonchalantly under his arm. Mrs. Endruz, she's sitting here, demurely, with her legs crossed. Now, I've seen this picture so many times in the National Gallery, but it wasn't until I came here and stood in this spot that I realised something incredibly interesting about it, which is that behind Gainsborough in the painting, hidden from sight, is the house in which Mr. and Mrs. Endruz actually lived. Now that's significant, not just because you didn't know it was there in the painting, but also because it explains one of the great mysteries of Mr. and Mrs. Endruz, which is why she is dressed in this flamboyant outfit of flowing pale blue silk, while he is wearing his scruffy shooting gear. Obviously what's happened is that he's been out doing the shooting while she has been waiting for him indoors and has now come out to meet him just a few hundred feet away from the house to sit on this bench. The biggest change in the landscape, of course, is this huge row of trees behind me. There's a forest down there now that isn't in the Gainsborough picture. Now that was planted deliberately by one of the later owners of the house. Apparently they built a council estate at the bottom of the hill. So the owner decided to try and mask it, and he planted this huge forest in between it and him. The corn's gone, of course, it's all been grassed over now, but if you look carefully you can actually still see the echoes of these furrows. There's little bits of them left. And what's interesting about the furrows is that they're what's left over from this revolutionary new use of an implement called the seed drill. Now this seed drill was the very latest in agrarian technology. It made harvesting the corn so much easier, and Mr. Endruz was very proud of being a pioneer in its use.
The seed drill wasn't widely taken up initially. Wealthy landowners were keen to use it as it was a public demonstration of how wealthy and how advanced they were. It wasn't received widely by the majority, especially the farm workers. In fact, they could see with this change, with mechanisation coming in, that actually their jobs would be at threat.
Mr. and Mrs. Endruz, these newlyweds, are showing off the fruit of their union, their land and their agricultural progressiveness. Of course, there isn't a peasant in sight, and none of this was achieved by these two getting their hands dirty in any way.
What the painting shows to me is the importance of the new farming methods to him, and it's a real statement that he's actually, you know, a very wealthy, powerful landowner and really accepting all these new ideas. And it's sort of really, look at me, I'm so, you know, really ahead of the game.
People say that Gainsborough was having a go at the rural rich in this picture. I think that's right. He was. These are greedy people. They've snatched the land away from its rightful owners, and they're parading themselves in front of it, while Gainsborough disapproves. But there's something else going on here, something more personal. If Gainsborough really did go to school with Mr. Endruz, I think he rather liked him. Mr. Endruz is sympathetically painted. He's dim but nice, lounging around on his land with his gun and his dog. It's Mrs. Endruz who worries me. She's surely one of the least attractive women in Gainsborough's art. Uptight, clenched, stiff. She's only a teenager, 18 years old, but she already has the demeanour of a middle-aged rural harridan. And what is that on her lap, that unfinished blob of canvas? I think there's only one thing it can be. That must be a feather. The tail feather of a cock pheasant, I warrant, and the rest of the bird is sitting on her knee. He's been out hunting, he's brought the bird back, she's got it on her lap, on a cloth, so that it doesn't bleed into her beautiful blue dress. But if that is a cock pheasant, what's it doing there? Is the dead bird an innocent avian corpse brought back from the morning's hunt and no more? Or does it have another meaning, a deeper one, a symbolic one? Gainsborough was a great admirer of Dutch art. And in Dutch art, you often find women, wenches, shopgirls, wives, holding up dead birds, cocks, snipe, duck. Look at this buxom butcher's maid. How fiercely she clutches that cock. Look at her unsmiling determination. Does it remind you of anyone? The fact is that most dead birds in Dutch art represent a man who's fallen into the clutches of a determined woman and been plucked. The bird in the hand of a buxom Dutch woman is invariably intended as a warning to us guys not to let ourselves be grabbed where it hurts. And all the naughty double entendres involving the word cock are entirely intentional. Gainsborough, a countryman, would have known all about these low country readings, and he would, I suggest, have been after just such a double entendre in his picture before it was censored. I think that he didn't like Mrs. Endruz much, that he was warning Mr. Endruz of the fate of the cock pheasant that's fallen into her lap and been grabbed. Just before this picture was finished, I think its secret meaning was spotted, and that Mrs. Endruz realised all too clearly how unflattering a portrait of her was being painted here. The picture was never finished because the sitters finally realised what Gainsborough was saying about them and didn't like it. Ah yes, the English countryside. The corn in the field, the larks in the sky, and the poison in the hearts of the people. Mr. and Mrs. Endruz is a great masterpiece of Gainsborough's early work, but if only he'd been allowed to complete it, it would have been greater still. There are a million stories in the world of art. This has been just one of them.